branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. I am very excited about today's panel. I think we have a fantastic lineup, and I'm really thankful to Marre for helping pull this together, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. You know, obviously, if it wasn't clear before, the pandemic highlighted the need for access to broadband and digital equity. The ability to manage through the pandemic for many was intrinsically lied to access to reliable broadband, allowed children to attend school, individuals to work from home, apply for benefits, look for a job, or visit with their medical provider. And it allowed for businesses to continue to operate in a social distancing environment. But as we all know, broadband access has been an ongoing topic for some time. Research has shown the benefit to businesses, households, the development of local economies, as well as macroeconomic growth. Studies of local labor markets have found positive impacts of broadband access and adoption on business location decisions and employment growth in rural areas, for example. However, there have been a number of challenges that have impeded expansion into underserved areas, particularly in rural areas, as well as household adoption in both urban and rural areas. This, despite the sizable estimated gains to the expansion. To put an estimate on those gains, one study of the economic impact of broadband infrastructure expansion among 25 developed countries found that a 10 percentage point increase in broadband access resulted in about a 1 to 1.5 percentage point increase in annual per capita growth. So this is an important issue which affects everyone. But before I turn it over to Marre and hear from the panel, I just would like to frame a little bit where Maryland is at the moment with respect to access and affordability. According to Broadband Now, using the federal standard of 25 megabits per second or faster, which we can talk about if that's a sufficient standard, Maryland does relatively well with respect to broadband access compared to other states, although there remain challenges in rural areas. Some 200,000 people in Maryland, however, do not have access to a wired connection capable of the same speeds. And then another 130,000 people do not have access to a wired internet connection at all. And then another 250,000 people have access with only one wired internet provider. But again, the issue isn't just access, it's also affordability, right? And so a recent study by the Able Foundation, based on analysis using the American Community Survey, the analysis of American Community Service data, survey data, found that some 520,000 Maryland households do not subscribe to wireline broadband service at home, which is about 23% of homes lacking service. Some 108,000 Maryland households with children under the age of 18 do not have wireline internet service at home. These households suffering from the homework gap are disproportionately poor, African American, and Hispanic. And a recent report by Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative found that, also looking at the ACS data, that about 40% of Baltimore's 243,000 households had no wired internet service, and 1/3 had no access to a desktop or a laptop. So I just kind of wanted to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about today. Again, I'm very excited about the panel that we have put together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marre Miller, Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for our panelists and everyone who's joining us for the session today. As Andy mentioned, I'm joining in my capacity as a fellow at the 21st Century Cities Initiative. I, along with my colleague, Mac McComas, published a paper in January that is a roadmap for how a city like Baltimore might achieve digital equity. And our strong feeling is that cities of the future must provide digital access and equity if we're going to succeed in job creation, in telemedicine, in education, and every aspect of participating in modern society. So what I'd like to do today is I'm going to ask a question, and maybe each of our panelists can briefly just introduce themselves, where they work and what they do, and then try to answer this first question. I have about 7 questions. We'll work through those, and we'd like to leave time at the end for questions from the audience. So please put those in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to those. So The first question that I have is that we seem to be in a moment when the digital divide has captured the attention of policymakers at every level of government. I'd like to ask you how you think about the economic costs of a digital divide and the economic potential that we could realize from closing that gap. Where are the greatest areas of inequity and what could we achieve with this work? And I'm going to start with our economist, Alex. Why don't you tackle this first?
Thanks, Mary. Thanks so much. My name is Alex Marre. I'm the regional economist at the Richmond Fed for Maryland, West Virginia, and DC. So I'm based out of Baltimore. We started hearing about broadband access throughout our district, really, starting over a year and a half ago. Even though it's been a long-term issue, we've really made a big effort over the past couple of years to expand our listening capabilities throughout our district. And broadband just kept coming up over and over and over again. We put together a listening session on entrepreneurship in a rural area, say. And yes, we talk about that, but at the root of it was, and if we really had broadband, it would help a lot to get entrepreneurship going in our community. And I'd say that's been true, even in urban areas, as Mary pointed out. Access to broadband, first of all, getting the infrastructure there so that service is available, and then adoption, getting people signed up, having it at an affordable price and a good quality is really critical for all forms of participating in modern society and certainly in the economy. I think the way that I think about it is, okay, costs and benefits. And one of the big problems with the broadband space is it's really hard to get solid data, really even on the status quo. I mean, depending on who you look at, the government or private, research outfits, there's anywhere between 20 and 40 million people who don't have the minimum standard of high-speed service internet in this country. And you put on top of that this lack of data on where the infrastructure really actually even is, it just becomes very difficult to come up with good estimates. That being said, the best numbers we have in terms of the cost to get fiber access to every household in the United States is about $80 billion. And where we've been on meeting that cost up until, I would say, this past year, is that we've really only tackled about a third of that up until this last year. With the COVID pandemic and people being more interested in that, the subsidies have started to really increase. And I'd say even at the federal and state levels, we're seeing a lot more support for broadband to kind of close that gap. But in terms of what we've been missing out on, the benefits that full digital access can provide, you can think about it in terms of, in my mind, people and places. Let's focus on the people very quickly and then move to places. In terms of people, you think about it, working adults. I mean, broadband access is critical for searching for jobs, for getting training, for getting telehealth services. I mean, there's so many economic benefits that come from having access to broadband service. I think one of the part of your question, Mary, was the greatest areas of inequity. I think it's for children. At the Richmond Fed, we've been doing some research on the effect of educational disruptions on the economic trajectory of people's lives. And the thing is that when you have these educational disruptions and people miss school in the classroom, say, like we've had during the COVID pandemic, or resources to their schooling has been dramatically cut, like it was during the Great Recession. Those sorts of effects on children start to cumulatively affect the rest of their lives. And so those changes at the very beginning of children's lives start to spiral into large effects that you see over the long run. So to me, children and digital learning is a big area of inequity in this country. And then in terms of places, the potential economic benefits, again, hard to get a handle on because of poor data. But, you know, as Andy was saying at the beginning, he was citing some studies looking at effects of broadband adoption on GDP. The economic research indicates that if you get broadband access or improve it within a country, you get big boosts to macro measures of economics opportunity, like GDP growth and the like. When you get at a more micro level, you start to see that in many places, like rural communities, say, which is an area that I've done a fair bit of research on, you can see, you know, boosts in job growth, lower unemployment rates, people being drawn to rural areas once broadband is available. So there's a whole litany of effects that you can see both for people and places to broadband access. And so I think it's so critical we're discussing this, because we're really missing out by not having full digital inclusion right now. And I'm hopeful we'll be turning the page on that.
Thank you. Kenrick.
Find the mute button. So thank you for having me. I'm Rick Gordon. I'm the director of the Governor's Office of Rural Broadband. If some legislation passes, I'll soon be the director of the Office of Statewide Broadband. So that'll be a little bit of a switch. And it kind of brings to point, you know, the definition of inequity. You know, you have people who have no broadband service options. You also have those who may have access but don't have the financial means to afford service. And they're both problems in Maryland as well as across the nation, but they require different solutions. You know, for a rural area, for instance, I once posed the question of broadband possibility to an audience in a rural county after I had spent 90 minutes driving 35 miles to the meeting. It was Charles County, south of DC. A lot of people commute. So I said, you know, what if we could take 10% of the traffic off the roads by having people work from home a day of the week? You know, the economic impact on the rural unserved is very apparent from this without even getting to the business and personal service and other benefits. You know, suddenly we wouldn't have to spend as much on road infrastructure. We could divert that money elsewhere. In our urbanized areas, similar benefits of broadband, working from home, being able to access service without having to travel to an office, even grocery shopping in the food deserts, they'd all be beneficial and they'd all have economic impact. As well as personal service and personal livability impact. So I think that they're all important, but as I said, there's different solutions and different problems. And you know, recently Maryland has been tackling the rural broadband lack of service, and we'll soon be starting to focus on more of the digital equity issues within the urbanized areas. So.
Terrific. I'm especially excited to welcome the new Director of Broadband and Digital Equity for the City of Baltimore, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Jason Hardebeck, as Mary mentioned, a brand new position in the Scott administration. So this is technically my third week. So I'm completely up to speed on everything. I just want to echo what Alex and Rick have said already. I think, you know, and maybe drilling down a little bit in terms of specifically Baltimore, right? And as Alex had said, you know, I think children are maybe being disproportionately affected. But, you know, the reality is where the inequity exists is where inequity exists for other aspects too, as Rick pointed out, food deserts, right? I mean, you can overlay the broadband desert, and it will line up very closely to other existing inequities. So that structural challenge is what we're really faced with. You know, in terms of the differences maybe between a rural and an urban challenge, I think infrastructure is usually much more expensive and a bigger factor, right? In rural areas, you don't have the density, you don't have the ability to, you know, the economies of scale. Affordability may be a bigger issue in an urban area like Baltimore City, but you know, when you have literally half of our Baltimore City school children, you know, 40,000 kids, they do not have reliable, dedicated, access, it's very difficult to participate fully in education. And on top of all the other challenges that we face, whether it's food or what have you. So I think that's actually something that we need to address. There was a mention made at how important this has become and how much of a priority it is, because during the pandemic, I think that's probably the first time that everyone has experienced this, as opposed to it's something that happens to poor people, right? So this is something, I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of seize that as a, and hopefully we recognize and remember how important this is going forward. Broadband is not a solution in and of itself. From an equity standpoint, I like to say that broadband is just the what, the why, and the how is what we need to be able to do with that access, and that's where we have to tie together all the other pieces, right? This is not, it's not an equality issue, right? It's equity is about creating a more of a level playing field that everyone can participate in fully. And Alex, I think, also said this very well, right? That these gaps that exist at an early age will continue to widen, and we need to address it today. So the final thing I would say is that from this attention, from a funding standpoint, I think we need to view this as what can we do to invest in helping to close this permanently versus subsidizing the costs of a temporary fixes.
Thank you for that. We've sort of touched on urban and rural needs. I'm going to maybe blend that into my next question, which is that the state announced $300 million in support for broadband and digital equity initiatives a little over a week ago. And this is being made available through funds that are coming from federal COVID-19 relief. The areas of support, very importantly, include not just access, but also affordability and technical assistance. So to me, the big question is, how do we not miss the moment here and squander what is a great opportunity from the state of Maryland, and even looking past that to some of the dollars that are teed up in the federal legislation? This seems like a landmark time to really bear down on the problem and see if we can't move the needle significantly with leapfrogging to a much better state. So I'm going to turn to Rick first and say, could you talk about this a little bit? How can we make sure we don't miss this amazing opportunity to find significant financial resources to change some of these things?
And there have been many questions on how this will work. The first thing that we need to do is develop a solid plan on how the funding will be implemented. The supplemental budget that included these funds directed us on where the legislature and the governor wanted to go with the funding. And we'll work within that framework. But since it's short-term funding expiring December 2024, we certainly don't want to build a huge machine to implement programs. I think we should be looking at programs that can be added to or expanded and then offered continued support once the funding runs out. There are programs that are doing some of this work now, and we can help expand their reach. The other thing that we're looking at, obviously, is infrastructure spending to try and close that rural divide. And we'll probably expand on our existing programs to utilize these funds as well. We do have programs in Maryland that can be built on. And I think that's a good way to not squander the money.
I'll ask Alex if you'd like to weigh in on this one. You talked about some very large figures nationally of what it might take. It feels like we're putting a stake in the ground here, though, with some real support for digital investment. Do you have any thoughts about how we can make the most of this opportunity, what we should be doing?
Yeah, I'm hugely encouraged by the sizes of support that's coming, both in Maryland and nationally. And that, as you mentioned, it's not only infrastructure, it's also tackling affordability issues. and just digital inclusion overall. There's going to be a renewed focus, I think, on improving digital literacy, which is really important. I mean, all the, one thing I think that's interesting is that all the studies on the economic impacts of broadband, you get a bigger bang for your buck with the more people using the service and knowing how to use it effectively. So if we really want to take advantage of this money, we've got to do this in a way that helps people, not only access the service, but be able to use it well, especially for the populations that are less likely to know how to use it to their advantage. So there's that piece. On the affordability side, I think one thing that's exciting is we're in this period of trying these broadband subsidies for service, providing households with, at the federal level, there was this huge infusion of cash into the FCC's Lifeline program, which essentially subsidizes broadband service for low-income households. And so this is a period of experimentation to see how that increased infusion of cash, how that moves the needle on getting people connected. And so I just think it's critical in terms of not squandering. We should be, following this carefully and doing some research and making sure we're keeping track of how the money's being used and if it's making a difference. And if we get on the other end of this money at the end of the year for the Lifeline program, say, some evidence of its impact will be really useful for charting the course beyond the pandemic. I think something Jason brought up that I'm pretty concerned about is that the notion of temporary fixes, and so we need to learn what's working, and use what we learned to advocate for continuing the support moving forward.
Thank you, Jason. How do we make the most of this moment?
Ditto. I agree with everything Rick and Alex has said. $300 million is a lot of money, sounds like a lot of money, but spreading it, a mile wide and an inch deep may not have a lasting impact, right? So that's one thing that I'm kind of conscious of, right? Is, on one hand, it's wonderful, it's a positive step, it's a stake in the ground. But hopefully it's not something, even though the amount may not be sustainable, that it's the last time that this, we're able to kind of do this at a state level. I think if it's an opportunity to really view this as an investment, and to Alex's point that we're taking an active role in supporting and stewarding efforts that, versus just divvying out checks to a lot of different areas and hoping, some work and some don't. We just have to, we being not just at the state level, but at the local level too, that we're coordinating these efforts as best we can, and that we're, there's a longer term play here.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So when I think about this, I think that there isn't a single actor that can make this happen. This is going to require a lot of cooperation and coordination. What is needed, do you think, between the private sector, philanthropy, nonprofits, state, local, federal government to help bridge the digital divide? Who's the sort of conductor that can pull this together and think about how we can coordinate between private providers of broadband service, local governments, state governments? How do we orchestrate that? I'd be interested in any ideas you have in terms of how we can put this together. And I might start this time with Rick again, because you're looking at it from the perch of the state, but what are the key ingredients here to making this happen?
So the first program I rolled out when I started my position about 3 years ago was to offer a partnership with local jurisdictions, ISPs, and the state to apply for USDA Reconnect funding. The state offered to help fund the applications. The local jurisdictions had to partner with an ISP so that we could focus the effort. And the state also provided some expertise on those applications. The local jurisdictions in the ISP partnership was important because the local jurisdictions have various facilities, various capabilities that are important to a build. And ultimately the ISP was the applicant. And all of this took communications. What did each partner want to achieve from the partnership? What could be offered? And I think it's typical of any partnership to work. There's a common goal, there's communications, and there's cooperation. That first effort did bring some of the first money into Maryland from USDA. Garrett County had a project going that had USDA funding, also with a very strong partnership. So that I use a lot of carrot and stick approach. The carrot obviously is I have some funding. The stick is if you don't have a good working partnership, that funding may not be forthcoming. But we definitely look at private sector and public partnerships as being very important, trying to roll this out. So that's been how we've been working with it.
Great. Alex, do you want to weigh in here?
Yes, just to say that, echo Rick's point that, and your point, Marre, that coordination is so key. So just to be honest, coming in from I knew nothing about broadband 2 years ago. Rick threw me in the deep end. And it's incredibly complicated. And I think just when we talk to people in communities throughout our district, there's just a sense of, yes, we know it's important, but we don't know where to start. I've been working with and speaking with folks at the Pew Foundation, who do a lot of work with states in terms of designing effective state broadband policy. And this is one of the areas they emphasize from their research, working with states all across the country, that broadband coalitions within states are particularly effective at driving investment and getting a lot of people on board with where the state's going with broadband expansion. And so there are a number of states that have various forms of that. And I think that's a really good idea to keep all sorts of stakeholders from across the board, state government agencies, to businesses, to nonprofits, because this broadband, I mean, given all, it's complicated, and then we've got all this money coming on the line, there's all sorts of rules, and we're all trying to figure it out on the fly. So this coordination point that you're making it's just going to get more important as we move forward. So yes, I think it's key, and I think getting as many people on board is really critical.
I'm going to turn to Jason next, but I guess I'd ask all of you to think about, who is best positioned to do this? Does it happen in the public sector? Does it happen in the philanthropic sector? Who can sort of put it all together? Because it is a mix of participants, of public-private partnerships, of savvy about going after funding and grants, and thinking about the real problem you're trying to solve, making sure that you are getting after that. But I'll go to Jason here and ask for your thoughts about this, because you're right in the seat where you're going to have to make this happen. So.
Thanks, no pressure. I think it's how you frame the challenge, right? And it's clear that market forces alone are not going to solve or close the digital divide. There's not sufficient profit motive in the current state to really ensure that happens. If our public sector takes a passive approach to this problem, and it's true for most of the major infrastructure, if not all the major infrastructure projects over the last century or so, right? That federal, state, local governments have played an integral role in making sure that those long-term investments that maybe did not have the short-term ROI necessary to have it make sense, right, for the private sector alone. That being said, it's also not something that public sector can solve on its own as well, right? So collaboration is key. I think at least for Baltimore City, we're viewing this as a public infrastructure need. And it's challenging enough to get all the different agencies and all the pieces to work together kind of cohesively in this problem within city government, but that's still not enough, right? We need clearly the private sector, the companies that are doing this now are and will remain a very important critical role, a part of that solution. But there's also other stakeholders, anchor institutions, corporations. It's the surrounding, counties. It's state government. It's all of the above, right? I use the analogy, and if you're familiar with the old fable of stone soup, where everybody kind of throws their own one little vegetable in the pot, and you end up with something that's delicious stew at the end. And I just happen to be the guy stirring the pot at the end of the day. So to me, Mary, I don't know that there's a single person or entity that's leading this. I think it needs to be a kind of a coalition where there's a shared purpose and a shared outcome that is, that we all agree on. Because at the end of the day, it's really about the outcome. It's not so much about, how we get there as that we all get there, and the all being kind of the key operative term there. Did I sufficiently dance around that?
Well, I often say, and I think we did say this in our paper, this isn't just about money. This is about leadership. It's about good policy. It's about good research that helps you identify the issues and then align the resources correctly. And I think that's the big challenge right in front of us. And I'm seeing a bunch of great questions come up in the Q&A, so I want to get to those, but I've got a few more I'd like to pose to the group. One is that we know that the lack of internet access is highly correlated with poverty. We also know that just providing access to the internet is not enough to bring everyone along. How can we achieve sustainable, affordable access and provide enough training to achieve digital literacy? And Alex, you touched on this, so I might go to you first, but we are in a period of experimentation of trying to get to that sustainable support. So people who achieve access can then keep access. I know a great fear among many is they're going to get some low cost service and next year it's going to be twice as expensive or 3 times as expensive, and they're afraid of that. And I think that's a legitimate concern. Some of the initiatives this year are really promising. And I think in our own work, what we found is that access may not be so hard to achieve. It's the cost of providing sustainable internet service to people and how we can do that as a society so that everyone can be on the same level. So, and you also touched on internet speed, and we might even talk about what are acceptable standards of service, what is reliable, what is sufficient to give people what they need. So I'll stop there. Start with Alex. Go to you next, Rick, and then Jason.
Thanks, Mary. So we've got this experiment with the subsidies. The previous federal subsidy through the Lifeline program, which is $10 off your broadband bill per month if you're a low-income household, had very low households subscribing to the program. I think only about 1/3 of eligible households were actually taking advantage of it. So this gets to your point of how important coordination is and getting everybody on the same page. And we need to advertise these programs at schools and libraries and make sure people know that they're eligible for these programs and helping them sign up for that. There's another question around, so subsidies is one area to tackle affordability. I think there's another area which has received attention before, but I'm sensing is getting renewed attention, which is around competition issues and making sure that there are a variety of providers offering service to help drive down the price. In theory, you could see that working. It's in very rural areas. I've been concerned that the more competition you open up, the less likely you would be to see infrastructure expanded. With the threat of we're gonna lose the profits we would get from expanding into this area because we'll have competitors. So why do that? But I think it's a good period of debate, and it's the recent bill or proposal around infrastructure from the White House does seem to be advocating using alternative providers. So we'll have another series of experiments here to see what encouraging other providers, what that does for the price of broadband, which I think will help on the affordability issue for the most part. Finally, how do we, as you were asking, how can we achieve this sustainably and provide enough training? I think this is key for the philanthropic sector to really get engaged in, and I know many philanthropies are, but it's really critical. And targeting libraries is also key to reaching both kids who are in school who don't have internet at home, and adult learners who maybe don't have broadband at home. A number of adult learners who don't have broadband at home use the library for their internet access. So those are just some ideas that are being tried across the country. I think, again, this is a period where we're going to learn a lot about these different strategies, and we'll have to gauge their success and use that information moving forward.
Rick.
Thank you. So digital literacy, in my opinion, ties directly to sustainability and affordability. I'm an engineer. I look at these things really just from the technical side many times, but I'm looking at the ongoing operation and maintenance of a network. I can throw whatever dollars I throw into a project, but if there are not people taking the service, the project will not be sustainable, and that's very important. Just to have a long ongoing project. The more subscribers are on a network, the less it should cost per subscriber. And the more people that understand broadband's capabilities and advantages, the more subscribers. So, it's always, and even if broadband is not available today, if there is knowledge of what broadband wants provides as the internet service providers go out looking for places to expand to, rather than having a 30% of people that the project passes taking service, that may go to 50 or 60%. And that again makes the project much more economically viable and much more sustainable.
Jason.
Thanks. I touched on this briefly already, and I think it's important that you don't view broadband as an end unto itself, right? It is really an enabler, and it needs to be tied. And so that's where digital literacy really comes into it. It needs to be tied to that kind of that end use. What's the reason why we all need affordable, high quality broadband? Because it's being integrated more and more into daily life, right? And we're seeing that. Obviously, this is a perfect example. A year ago or so, we would be having this conversation in person. And I think for a lot of us, we take that as a given, right? We don't have a challenge with broadband. It's not a luxury item. We're not making a decision between our fixed wireless or fixed broadband costs and our wireless bill, right? We have both. I would venture that most, if not probably everybody on this call, doesn't make a decision. And that's not necessarily the case for folks who have significant challenges in finances. So I think that's, for this to be sustainable, as I said before, I think we have to stop looking at it as an expense and really viewing it as an investment in the kind of future that we want for everybody. And so very specifically, my role, I'm spending as much time as I am looking at kind of the physical infrastructure piece, as I am talking and trying to understand how that integrates with those individuals, agencies, community groups. They're really on the front lines of really starting, understanding how people need to provide access. And so focusing on those use cases as we move, education online, telehealth, telemedicine, obviously remote work. Like if we're not addressing those same needs at the same time we're building out a physical infrastructure, the divide doesn't go away, it just gets wider.
So thinking about different models that we can deploy, some of what I've read about the federal proposals for digital equity seem to favor municipal and publicly provided service. And this is an idea that we explored in our paper, thinking about sort of a hybrid model of publicly provided internet access through community anchors, whether libraries, schools, public housing projects, recreation centers, alongside privately provided broadband access in more traditional delivery models. But I guess I'd be interested in knowing whether you've seen any good examples of this in Maryland or elsewhere that we could think about in terms of publicly provided infrastructure or hybrid models. There may be some examples on the Eastern Shore of Maryland that I've heard about. So I might start with Rick and see if you have any insights here.
Sure. So actually, for municipal broadband, the best example in Maryland is Westminster. They built a fiber optic network that crisscrossed the city, and they brought in a partner that actually maintains and provides service. Ting is actually their provider. So their network goes to their anchor institutions, obviously, and then provides last mile service to the households that want to take service. And it's working. It's been in operation for 2 years, I believe. They are building a subscriber base and are actually looking to expand the network into Carroll County. So it is working, but you notice I said there is a partner there. Most municipalities are not in the broadband business, nor do they want to be. The municipalities, the local jurisdictions that are interested in providing this service or in building a network almost always look for somebody to actually operate it and provide the last mile or the customer service. That said, I built a network in upstate New York with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. And it was supposed to be an open access network, but there simply weren't enough potential subscribers. They initially wanted 3 providers to operate. They only had 3,000 households. They had 1,500 subscribers, a 50% take rate. They started out with 2 providers. They dropped down to 1 provider. And now the tribe actually provides service directly because there was not enough of a concentration of households to allow that open access network to function. Rockport, Maine has a community network that they provide last mile service from, but again, it's the city actually does provide the service in that aspect, but they had to build they had to build an infrastructure internally to be able to do that. A lot of people look at, well, we do water and sewer. How hard could broadband be? Completely different animals. Water and sewer, everyone has to take service. You don't have an option. internet provisioning, it's an option. So, whether a municipality can do it cheaper, a local jurisdiction can do it cheaper, that's always a question. Even water and sewer, most local jurisdictions, if they can find somebody who wants to buy their system and operate it, they're happy to get that off their books. So I think if we start looking at municipal systems, there still needs to be that internet service provider that is probably going to provide the service. And I think that becomes a partnership issue.
Thank you for that. Alex and Jason, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Sure, I will. I will, echo what Rick has said, right? I don't think there certainly isn't a single approach to this, right? And I view municipal broadband as, the end of a spectrum of an infrastructure decision. I think Chattanooga is usually held up as like kind of the gold standard for municipal broadband, but they were building on existing competencies, electric utility, right? They already had the last mile figured out. It had all the pieces. Still wasn't an easy thing to do, but I think you're right. It's a very complex issue, and it's not something I think you enter into assuming it's going to be easy and cheap and sustainable. I've always kind of viewed municipal broadband being when a city is actually, or municipalities providing that service, is sending you the bill, is providing customer service, and the implementation and maintenance is the nuclear option. I think it's something we have to keep in the realm of possible, because if there is not another choice, and Rick pointed out a really good example, right, where you were kind of forced into it, but you go into it eyes wide open and recognizing what that means. There's a number of different ways that a municipality can play an active role. And, in Baltimore City, for example, we have a lot of infrastructure potential between our conduit system, existing fiber, the ability to invest in existing infrastructure. And one of my charters is to look at the potential for municipal broadband, and other models. Open access networks are one of those opportunities, I think. We may or may not have the scale to attract multiple providers, and I think it has been shown in many different cities that choice tends to improve quality, drive down costs, and overall improve the availability of broadband. But that doesn't automatically mean that it's going to serve everyone the same way, right? So that's where we, as certainly as Baltimore City, need to really keep focused on the most challenging aspects and the challenging areas of the city. But still a lot to figure out.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one lightning round question of the three of you and turn to questions that we have in our Q&A. Just in a couple words, what underappreciated assets do Baltimore and Maryland have that can be better leveraged to strengthen digital access? Who wants to start here? Raise your hand. Okay, Jason.
All right, I'll give it a shot. I think Baltimore, one of our kind of underutilized or underappreciated assets is the fact that I think there's been a reckoning. I think we've come to an understanding that the structural inequities that exist are real, and that, in some ways Baltimore has been a pioneer in those. And so recognizing that is, kind of the first step in understanding, right? You can make change when you realize that this is not a made up problem.
Alex?
Yeah, I would just say, I think something that's remarkable about Maryland is you have such a rich and deep philanthropy context here. so that's point one. I think that I've been amazed and pleased to see the number of people rowing in the same direction on this. And I think that's very powerful. Number two, from the perspective of rural communities, broadband is more effective for rural communities that are closer to population centers. And we really have that in Maryland. There are for sure places that are hard to reach, but relative to some places in Alaska, say the other extreme, there's real promise here for broadband expansion in terms of unleashing economic potential throughout the state.
Great. And Rick?
So I'll throw out, the city of Baltimore, all of our urbanized areas have a myriad of nonprofits, government agencies that can be leveraged to help with digital literacy. We're currently in the, back to the $300 million budget, there's money there for what we're calling tech extensions, which will build on the ag extension model of training trainers. There's also nonprofits that are delivering last mile service to provide a digital equity solution that can also be worked with. In general, in the state level, the Department of Housing and Community Development, where I'm housed, is a trusted partner for many, many different projects, has a great reputation within the city and within the state. All of these entities should really join forces to help educate and get the word out of what broadband is and what an asset it is, and that it can be utilized. So as far as underappreciated assets, there are assets that people just aren't aware of, and we need to build them up and leverage them further in the process.
Thank you. So let's turn to questions, and I will ask you just to provide brief answers. There's a fantastic commentary going on in the chat room while we're talking, but I'll start with the Q&A. And this is a question for Rick. It's Mr. Gordon, how do you define equity in the context of broadband?
Well, and that relates back to the first question that you asked, or that you posed. Equity is both the ability to afford broadband as well as the ability to have access to broadband. Those are both. I apologize for the background noise. They were quiet until I unmuted. So it's really a two-pronged answer. We have those who can't afford broadband and those who don't have access to broadband, and they take two completely different efforts to solve. And that's something that we've been focusing on. We've been focusing on the access to infrastructure from my office, and we're going to start focusing on the equity portion of it.
Okay. The next question is anyone thinking through providing broadband internet service for free and decommodifying it? It is an essential good. And that touches on a number of the points made in the chat room. I'll ask Alex if you could briefly touch on that, and Jason, if you have any further thoughts on
it. The short answer is no. I haven't heard of any efforts to, on a large scale effort, provide broadband for free. I think the question of, there may have been a few years ago a question about is broadband a utility? I don't think there's any question about that anymore. It's a necessary utility for all the reasons we've discussed here today. And in terms of expanding infrastructure, if there's any, there has been despair in the broadband space in terms of, we just can't, close this digital divide. But, I think you just have to look at the rural electrification effort in the 30s for another example of, this is possible. We'll probably have a different solution now than we did for that effort, but I think there's so many parallels between electricity and broadband service. certainly in terms of how necessary it is for participation in modern life.
Jason, you're welcome to weigh in on that, but I wanted to ask you the question we have on 5G, if I could. And you can read it in the Q&A, but it's basically the subject of 5G is one that has been discussed both statewide and locally for at least the past 3 legislative sessions. Something that that would tie in and support digital expansion efforts, but it never seems to advance, leaving each community to its own efforts. What are your thoughts on 5G and how we advance policy statewide rather than piecemeal, county by county, city by city?
Okay, I want to make sure I want to understand the context, something with time. So a couple thoughts on 5G. One is that I think in conversations or discussions in the past that I've either had or been party to with, for example, elected officials, sometimes 5G has been kind of offered up as a panacea or like obsoleting the need for fiber. Like you don't have to worry about your infrastructure. 5G is coming, right? And that's going to be a solution. I think that's it's not completely true, right? I mean, 5G actually requires even more fiber, right? So there's that piece that it's not going to obsolete what we've done in the past. The other, I'd say, issue or concern I would have with 5G is that doesn't really address the issue of affordability, right? Agreed that it is going to be an important and part of how we consume access, mobilely and with high bandwidth, but it's not clear that that's actually going to solve a lot of those access problems. We know right now a lot of our lower income users are accessing the internet via mobile devices on prepaid data plans. I like to say it's the same way as or same analogy as somebody who's drinking bottled water from the corner store because they don't have access to clean, low-cost tap water, right? That's not a solution, and it's a scarcity issue. If the question is about how we coordinate our efforts on 5G, up till now, and perhaps in the future, I think 5G is being addressed just by the private sector. I know Baltimore, for example, there are several franchise agreements to enable telecom providers to be able to expand their networks in the city. So I think it's going to be a part or a complement to the bigger picture. I don't know that it's, in the short term at least, a solution, at least for what we're talking about from a digital equity standpoint.
Rick, do you have anything to add on 5G you want to say from your spot?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the providers that are, and I'm assuming that we're sticking to millimeter wave 5G, which is the urban version of 5G. The providers are looking for still the best return. They want to build in the upper income, the business downtown areas. I don't see 5G rolling out into the poorer residential areas. I just don't see it as a solution for those areas at this point. Sometime in the future, it may. We obviously started out with cell phones in urban areas, and they slowly rolled out into rural areas. The rural areas are still far behind the urbanized areas with access to cellular facilities today. I think it's going to take that same amount of time. And we're 20 years into the cell phone realm. So I think it's going to take that long for 5G really to become more of a possible solution. And that's just too long.
Okay. I know we're at 11 o'clock, which is our stop time. There's been a great series of comments, questions in the chat room, and I can't thank the people enough that have joined this conversation and made this such a rich exchange for all of us. So I will thank everyone, and I'll say that I think one of the greatest resources we have are the people that are thinking about this issue and are interested in this issue, the coalitions that have grown over the last 2 years. I'm very familiar with the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition, the work they're doing to help provide digital literacy training. There's a lot of power behind this idea and this need. And so I welcome the chance to talk to all of you today and to do this with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Thank you. And I hope that we'll just keep pushing this conversation forward and make it more than a conversation. Thank you, all of you.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you, everyone.